where do you need to add error handling? This is the question that you will come up against first. In your program, as you're looking for places, where do I need to add this sort of code to make sure that errors don't crash my program? You want to think about, where are you getting input from users? That's a logical place to add error handling, because you want to check what they're entering and make sure that it's usable. If you're doing a calculation, that's a good place to add error handling. Doing calculations is a great place for easier to ask for forgiveness kind of code, because you may not be able to predict what kind of error. If you're adding something to a list, you want to make sure and check that data to make sure it's what you want it to be before you add it to a list. And then before you say, when you save or retrieve data, that's another time. Now, you can't save or retrieve data yet, but you will be soon. And that's a good place to add error handling. So if you look at your code, okay, let's look at the fruit. Here's my fruit example again. And let me uncomment this piece of it here. There we go. Okay, so in my fruit database, I have these inputs, and these would be good places for me to add error handling, right? So the new ID number, now I have a format in mind, but let's just say I want to make sure that the user is entering something that's not an empty string. Okay, that's all I have. That's all I want, is to make sure it's not empty. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start a while loop around that. And after they enter the ID number, I'm going to say if strid, if the length of strid is less than 1, then it's not good for me, and I want to print that's not a valid ID. If it's longer than 0, or it's 1 or greater, then it's going to be okay for me. Then I'm going to say print, or no, I'm just going to break that loop, and that's it. So there is a very simple look before you leap routine that says you're going to enter a new ID number, and if you enter something that's empty, a 0 length string, if you just hit enter instead of typing something, it's going to say that's not a valid ID, and it'll keep going until they enter something that's longer than 0, and then it will break and move on to the next thing. So I would probably, if I was really working at this, I would make sure that I do this for each one of these. Now, for the ID number, if I wanted to be really thorough, the ID number should be something that doesn't already exist. So if bananas had an ID of FR1, I don't want to enter grapefruit with an ID of FR1. So probably in here, I would also do some checking to see if the ID already existed in the database. That would be another thing I would check for. But we're not going that deep today. We're just going to keep it on a very simple level. Okay, so that would be a good place for look before you leap. Now this one, you can see here, the price. The price has got to be something that can be turned into a float. So if I'm going to do all of that in one line, I can't use look before you leap, because I'm already leaping on that same line of code. I'm literally taking that input, passing it to float, and then putting it in the variable. So if I want to do things like that, I can, but I need to make sure that it's not going to generate an error first. So if with that, what I would want to do, and I can use the while true again around that, but I'm going to use easier to ask for forgiveness on that one. So I'm going to enter that, and I'm just going to say, let's try this. And if it works, we're going to break. If we get through that with no error, it will break. If it does have an error, though, we're going to print this must be a valid dollar amount. So then it will use easier to ask for forgiveness, because if they enter something that's not a valid dollar amount, it will generate an error, which means it will not execute the break. It'll go to the accept. It'll print needs to be a valid dollar amount. It'll go back to this, and it'll keep looping until they get it right, and then it will break. So those are just two ways of doing that, and it's at the time I'm getting user input. Bless you. Now, if I'm doing this very carefully here, then when it goes to add these things, I won't have the issue. Okay. Now, if I had a function in here that was something like, somebody wants to buy 3 bananas and 2 oranges or whatever, where it does calculations, I would want to be careful about the calculations as well. But if I run this now, oops, that's not going to run that program. If I run this, okay, if I want to add a fruit, new ID number. So if I hit enter and I don't give it a valid ID, then that's going to not let me pass. So if I enter the valid ID, new fruit name, fruit, enter the price. So this is the other one that I did error checking on. Okay, and then how many? And then when I list the fruit, okay, so there is the fruit that I just added. Okay. So that is a simple way of adding error checking. And again, this is the example code that I used to introduce the employee database assignment. So they're very similar structurally. And you can see here, we have on line 15 to 21, the look before you leap, where I'm checking to see if what they entered meets my criteria. And on line 24 through 29 here, this is what easier to ask for forgiveness looks like, using try and accept inside a while loop to force them to enter a valid dollar amount before moving on. So that's kind of what I'm looking for in your employee database assignment. Again, don't reinvent the wheel. Don't restart your code from scratch there. Use the code you already did and just add. You can see I added probably, less than 10 lines of code total there to do that error checking. So it shouldn't be a huge lift. You just need to add your code in a strategic place so that it does the checking.